All right, so you sent over this article about Bitcoin, and it's about how it's becoming a bigger deal in the financial world, and like how big players, especially BlackRock, see it as a key part of the future of finance. And
Yeah.
honestly, there's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the most interesting things about all of this is how the talk around Bitcoin has, well, changed. Like we've gone from banks basically saying it's like play money for criminals to these huge financial institutions quietly, but like very deliberately getting their hands on a ton of it.
It's true. It really does feel like this, well, quite revolution is happening right under our noses.
Mm.
But there was this one thing in the article that really caught my eye. It talked about something called a silent wealth transfer. Honestly, it's kind of a concerning thought when you really think about it. What exactly does that mean, and how does this like silent transfer work with something like Bitcoin?
Well, it's a fascinating thing to think about, really. Basically, when institutions and just wealthy people, when they build up these huge amounts of Bitcoin, what they're really doing is, well, they're shrinking the supply that's left for everyone else. The article, I think it was this article, yeah, it said that a crazy amount, like 60% of all Bitcoin, it's basically what they call illiquid right now.
Okay, so to be honest, illiquid sounds a little like, financial jargon. Could you break that down a bit? What that mean, in plain English?
Sure. Basically, illiquid just means that those Bitcoins are like off the market. They're not being traded, they're being held in like long-term storage by these big players. Imagine a giant game of musical chairs, right? But the music stopped, and all the big players, they've already grabbed most of the seats. That's kind of what's happening with Bitcoin. This limited supply combined with more and more people wanting in, well, it just pushes the price up. That's the mechanics of the silent wealth transfer, the value shifting towards those who, maybe saw something in Bitcoin early on, took a chance on it.
I see. So it's like the early bird gets the Bitcoin, right? It makes you wonder if it's too late to get in on it. But you mentioned institutions like BlackRock getting involved now, and they're not really known for, risky bets, are they?
Exactly. BlackRock, they're not like some new tech company. They manage like trillions of dollars, right? For pension funds, governments, you name it. So when BlackRock makes a move, the entire financial world, they take notice. And the thing is, they're not just buying Bitcoin. They're actually saying it could be like a solution to some of the economic problems we're facing, like inflation, which is a pretty big deal.
That is a big statement. I mean, most people understand that inflation, it eats away at the value of their money over time. So how's Bitcoin supposed to be the answer to that?
Well, see, it's like this. Traditional currencies, governments can just print more, right? Which can lead to inflation. But Bitcoin, it's different. It has a fixed supply, a hard limit. There can only ever be 21 million Bitcoins. That's it. And that limited supply is what makes it, possibly a good hedge against inflation, a way to protect your money from losing its value as, everything else gets more expensive.
So it's like if those traditional currencies are, I don't know, a leaky boat in rough seas, Bitcoin's being presented as like a more reliable life raft.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And when someone like BlackRock, a pillar of traditional finance, starts talking about Bitcoin like this, well, it makes you think, right? Are they just, hedging their bets? Or do they actually believe that the traditional systems, the ones we've all relied on, are maybe not as stable as we think they are?
And speaking of these institutions, quietly buying up Bitcoin, this brings us specifically to BlackRock. There were some pretty bold statements from them in this article, wouldn't you say? BlackRock saying Bitcoin could be like an actual solution for things like inflation. That's a pretty bold statement. It really makes you think like maybe they know something the rest of us don't. But if even BlackRock is, getting into Bitcoin, doesn't that just make that whole wealth inequality thing even worse? Like, isn't the people who already have money who are in the best position to buy more of, well, anything?
Yeah, that's a good point. And the article, it did talk about that whole idea. Like Bitcoin could make wealth inequality worse, but it could also maybe help everyday people be more financially secure. It's complicated, that's for sure. Like we've seen how the early Bitcoin adopters, a lot of them, they were already doing pretty well for themselves, and they've made a killing as Bitcoin has gone up in value. And if that just keeps happening and it's not easy for regular people to get into Bitcoin, then yeah, it could definitely widen the gap between the rich and everyone else.
So it becomes this kind of like rich get richer game, which honestly isn't a very hopeful thought.
Yeah.
But the article also talked about the other side of that. Bitcoin is this like tool for financial empowerment. How would that even work?
Well, you got to remember, we're still kind of in the early days with all of this whole Bitcoin thing. Think back to like the early days of the internet, right? Some people thought it was just a fad, but others, they saw that it could be way bigger. They understood that like if everyone started using it, the internet, it could totally change how we communicate, how we share information, even how we do business.
Yeah, and look at us now. I mean, we basically live online. So are you saying that, like, Bitcoin now is kind of like the internet back then?
Kind of, yeah. That's a good way to think about it. The thing about Bitcoin is that it's decentralized, which means no one controls it. No government, no bank, no company. And that's a big deal for some people because it means that, in theory anyway, it has the potential to give people more financial freedom than they've ever had. Like, imagine you live in a country with a really unstable currency, or maybe it's hard to even use a bank. Bitcoin could be a way for you to, like, store your money and send it to people without having to rely on those systems that, well, might not be very reliable.
Okay, so it's not really about Bitcoin itself being good or bad for, like, wealth equality. It's more about how people use it, how it's regulated, all that.
Exactly. Like any powerful tool, Bitcoin, it can be used to make things more unequal, or it can help level the playing field. A lot depends on the choices we make as a society to make sure everyone has access to it, and that's used responsibly, ethically, especially as it keeps evolving.
That's a really important point. And I'll be honest, it's a lot to wrap your head around. Speaking as someone who's not exactly a financial whiz, I can see how it'd be easy to just feel overwhelmed by all of this. What would you say to someone listening who's probably thinking, okay, this is interesting and all, but what does it actually mean for me in my life?
I get that. I totally get that feeling of information overload. The thing to remember is you don't have to run out and buy a bunch of Bitcoin right now. The important thing is to understand the bigger picture, like the things we're talking about, and how they might affect your finances in the future.
So it's more about being aware and prepared, not like chasing after some get-rich-quick scheme.
Yeah, exactly. When it comes to your money, slow and steady is usually the way to go.
Makes sense. So where do we even start? What are some practical, like, first steps our listener can take to, I don't know, make sense of this whole evolving world of finance? So we've talked about how it's important to understand the bigger picture, but what does that look like, practically? Like, what are some actual steps our listener could take?
Well, a good place to start is, thinking about diversification. I'm sure you've heard the saying, don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Right, of course. And for most people, that means what? Stocks, bonds, maybe some real estate if they're lucky. But we're talking about like alternative assets here,
Yeah.
right? That honestly sounds a little intimidating.
It really doesn't have to be. When we say alternative assets, we just mean anything beyond those traditional investments. And yeah, Bitcoin is definitely in that category. You don't have to, bet the farm on crypto, but even a small amount, it can be a good way to like hedge against inflation, just like we were saying. Protect yourself from some of that economic uncertainty.
So like dipping your toes in the water, not diving in head first. Got it. Anything else our listeners should be thinking about?
Stay informed. This world, the crypto world, it changes fast. Regulations change, new tech pops up every day. And the market itself, well, it can be a wild ride. This isn't something you can just, put your money in and forget about. You got to stay engaged, stay informed.
Do your research, absolutely. And speaking of research, there was some, well, pretty interesting stuff in that article about some predictions for Bitcoin's future value. Could you, I don't know, humor me a bit? What were some of the numbers being thrown around?
Yes, you want me to get out my crystal ball. Okay, but I have to say, I'm not giving financial advice here, and these are just predictions. Nobody really knows. That said, yeah, the article mentions some analysts who think Bitcoin could hit like anywhere from $300,000 to $600,000 in the next cycle.
Wow. Those are like life-changing numbers for some people.
Mm.
I imagine even hearing numbers like that could make someone, want to go all in. What would you say to someone feeling that, like that impulse?
Remember what I said about the crypto market being a wild ride? Well, those predictions, as exciting as they might sound, they're not guarantees. Don't let those numbers, you know, cloud your judgment or make you do anything you're not ready for.
Good advice. Like you always say, knowledge is power. Okay, so we've covered a lot today. We talked about those silent wealth transfers, the potential impact on wealth inequality, and of course BlackRock and their, well, let's just say their interesting take on Bitcoin.
Yeah.
But before we wrap things up, I've got one last question. It's been bugging me.
I'm all ears.
If these big institutions, if they're really betting on a future where Bitcoin is like a major player, what does that even mean for, well, the regular financial system, our banks, our currencies? Is this the beginning of the end for all of that?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to be honest, nobody knows for sure. It's entirely possible that we're seeing like the very start of a massive shift in, well, everything, how we think about money, how we use money, or it could be a bubble that's going to burst. We'll just have to wait and see.
Okay, so that's a bit of a cliffhanger for our listeners.
Mhm.
The future of finance, folks. Unpredictable, but definitely interesting.
The best thing you can do during times of change is stay informed, stay curious, and, well, be a part of shaping that future.
Couldn't agree more. And that just about wraps up our deep dive into Bitcoin, BlackRock, and what it all might mean for the future of, well, money itself. As always, a huge thank you to you, the listener, for joining us on this journey. Keep exploring, keep learning, and we'll catch you next time for another deep dive.